I've called this a dual perspective. So when he reacts with anger or accusation, or when she becomes more controlling or dismissive, you can begin to understand both of these reactions as organized responses to feeling destabilized internally. In other words, something is going on inside each one of these individuals. If you can hold this in mind, it changes how you interpret their behavior, because now you don't see it as just they're labeling me, but you see it as maybe they are dysregulated. Maybe they are destabilized internally. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In the last episode, we started to unpack what actually drives high conflict relationships, especially when the conflict escalates quickly, feels personal, and seems to go nowhere. We look beneath the surface at the personality dynamics, the defensive patterns, and the ways that both people can get pulled into a destructive cycle that keeps repeating itself. In this episode, we're going to pick up where we left off. We're going to return to that same prototypical interaction so we can think about how to reduce escalation and maintain emotional regulation, not just to understand it, but to think about what you can actually do in those moments when things start to escalate. The key to preventing escalation, in part, is to recognize that your reaction is not random, that even strong reactions, like calling each other names, are organized around protecting one's, and I quote, sense of self. When we talk about someone protecting their, and I quote again, sense of self, this means that the person may rely on defensive behaviors to protect their internal experience of who they are, how they see themselves, how they want others to see them, and their feeling of being valued and competent in relationships and in the world. This way of protecting oneself, these defensive behaviors, is critical when we think about how someone relates to others, because these defenses don't just protect the self, they also shape how you experience and behave people around you, which is why I wanted to briefly return to it here. Of course, I went into this in detail in that prior episode. Anyway, once you begin to recognize, and I quote, these defensive behaviors as they're happening in real time, the next question becomes, how do you interact without making things worse? How do you respond when a simple comment turns into defensiveness, accusation, or shutdown? How do you hold your ground without escalating the conflict? And finally, how do you maintain some level of emotional regulation when the interaction itself is pulling you to react? Let's think through this together. Let's think about how to reduce escalation, how to contain the interaction, and how to begin shifting these patterns in a more productive direction without getting pulled deeper into that destructive cycle. So to make this more concrete, let's look at a prototypical interaction, one we started to lay out in the prior episode. Imagine a couple in the middle of a familiar but highly charged moment. Something has just happened, and within seconds, the interaction is already escalating. On the surface, it looks like he's angry, he's reactive, and he's putting her down, calling her names. She presents as overwhelmed and trying to manage things, but calls him aggressive, and finally she says, "You're jealous." Underneath the name calling, the crying, and aggression, we slowly come to discover that he experiences himself as displaced and secondary, especially as her attention shifts toward the baby, her friends, or in this example that we're following, her family of origin. And you could fill in the blank there if you've ever been in this situation in terms of what escalates the conflict. She, on the other hand, experiences herself as solely responsible. In other words, she's the responsible one in the home, having to make all the decisions, manage the household, and keep things functioning because he's always at work or disengaged, checked out, withdrawn. And this is where her control can start to take shape in a very concrete way. She may begin making decisions on her own around childcare, or like increasing time spent with her family, or even bringing her family more fully into the home to live with them. These are decisions he has strong feelings about, but experiences himself as having little say. In other words, she's making the decisions. Now, this is all the manifest presentation, don't forget. Well, once we start to see what's really happening, though, beneath the surface, those are the vulnerabilities, the defensive patterns, and the competing internal experiences. We can begin to recognize the triggers in real time and start thinking about how to respond without escalating the conflict further. The next logical question becomes, now what? What do we do now if we start recognizing the defensive patterns and what's going on beneath the surface? Again, all the stuff that I laid out in more detail in part 1. What do you actually do when you begin to recognize these patterns in your own relationship? How do you respond when these defensive dynamics, the name calling, yelling, attacking, or withdrawing, they take over and the conversation starts to escalate? Or even worse, the withdrawal, it goes nowhere. Now you have two people painfully separated. So let's come back to that question. What do you actually do when things start to escalate? The first thing to recognize is that escalation happens very quickly, especially in these high conflict moments when one partner feels controlled or dismissed and the other feels attacked or accused of being, and I quote, the problem. You know how that happens. It's always the other person that's the problem, or even labeled, believe it or not, as narcissistic or unreasonable. And often this happens before you've had a chance to think. And I put emphasis on the word think. I'm going to come back to that. From a psychodynamic perspective, that's because you're no longer just responding to the moment. You're responding from within a defensive organization that's been activated. Something in the interaction has touched a more vulnerable internal experience, and the reaction that follows is an attempt to protect against that internal feeling. So, one goal, of course, is to eliminate the reaction, but that's a lofty goal. So let's say the initial goal is to slow it down. Slow it down enough to recognize that you're no longer just responding to what's happening. And I know maybe that sounds strange to you, but I'm doing this from a psychodynamic perspective because from that perspective, there's always more going on that's functioning at an unconscious level. And that's what I'm suggesting, that you're responding not just to what's happening. Of course, there's one foot in reality, but there's another foot in what? And what it triggers inside of you. You're responding to what it means about you. Like, for example, what kind of man am I? And I'm quoting, if I don't respond to her provocation or her insults. In other words, as we begin to unpack his aggressive responses, what we begin to see is that he feels unmanned if he does not respond. It's often at this point in the interaction that conflict takes another step forward. So he responds when accusations start to take shape, like he's a narcissist, and then he returns, she's cold, she's withdrawn. This usually signals that the interaction has moved beyond a simple disagreement into something much more emotionally charged. In other words, this is not even about what they're arguing. It's not about what they came in trying to discuss. It becomes about so much more. The person making the accusation is often flooded. Let me say that again. The person making the accusation, he's a narcissist, is already flooded. They're trying to organize overwhelming feelings like hurt, anger, or humiliation. And the label itself, he's narcissistic, or she is withdrawn and cold. The label itself can intensify the dynamic, putting one person in the position of, and I quote, the problem. Remember, it's the other person's fault. This only escalates and intensifies the dynamic. That's what I'm suggesting that you begin to consider. While the other person becomes the injured one, or the reasonable one. Like, I know what I see. I know that he's narcissistic. I know how disturbed he is. I know he has anger problems. See, they're the reasonable one. Not surprisingly, this tends to trigger a strong defensive reaction in the other partner, and the escalation continues. That moment, right at the edge of escalation, that is the critical moment. It's crucial that that moment gets recognized. Instead of immediately responding outward, the work is to begin turning inward, even briefly, and asking yourself, what just got activated in me? So in other words, if this is the fellow, if you're listening and you've been called the problem or you're the narcissist, the question is, can you begin to say, what just got activated in me before you snap back and call your partner, your friend, your parent another name? Let me give an example. Like in the dynamic with the high conflict couple that we've described, that we've been following, are you suddenly feeling pushed out? Irrelevant. These are questions that you can ask yourself. So are you feeling pushed out, unrecognized, like you don't have a say, or you don't matter, or you're feeling overwhelmed, like everything is falling on you and no one is stepping in to help? You're all alone in this, taking care of everything. Not in a highly intellectual way, but in a simple observational way. I'm asking you to observe this, to reflect, to think, does any of this resonate with you? And remember, I said there could be many examples of this, but that's the piece right there that I'm encouraging you to consider is, what does it already trigger? Or what does it trigger that's already in you? Because once you can name the internal experience, you're already creating a small amount of space between the trigger and the reaction, if that makes sense. From there, the task becomes containing the reaction rather than expressing it impulsively. And this is important because on this podcast, we often talk about, I'm quoting, containing, but usually I come at it from the other angle about containing the other person. I did a whole series on living with the vulnerable narcissist and how to contain them and relate to them in a different way. So here, usually it's about containing the other person, containing their rage, containing their reactivity. But here the shift is toward containing your own emotional dysregulation in the moment. This doesn't mean suppressing or invalidating what you feel. That's not what I mean by containing. It means holding it so that it doesn't immediately organize the entire interaction. When reactions come out too quickly, too impulsively, through criticism, defensiveness, or again, withdrawal, they tend to confirm the other person's internal fears. Let me say that by way of example, if that's not clear. So for example, reinforcing in this couple that we're following, reinforcing his experience of being excluded. In other words, if he is critically attacking her decisions around managing the house, she is more likely to do what in the future? To become more controlling, to take charge of decisions on her own, or retreat to her family to feel safe and protect herself. This is precisely what escalates the cycle, because it leaves him with exactly what he doesn't want, which is his wife is taking charge of the situation.
Let's take a quick break.
Are you tired of feeling like you're walking on eggshells all the time? Do you feel drained, confused, or like nothing you do is ever good enough? Are you stuck in a cycle of elation, then criticism and confusion? If any of this sounds familiar, you're not alone. And that's exactly why I created Office Hours with Dr. Anthony Mazzella. That's me. Office Hours is a low-cost, small group space where you could bring your questions about narcissistic traits and dynamics and the places where you feel stuck. You'll be met with honest, grounded feedback. I'll hold the group with structure, but there's also space for a real conversation. This is a space designed for anyone looking for clarity, insight, and support. If that sounds like you, just click the link in the show notes to join us. Okay, I hope to see you there. Anyway, the main point here is that the containment is not passive. It's not sitting there being quiet. It's an active process of regulating how and when you respond, and more in particular, how you respond. This is the critical piece. At the same time, it's important to begin recognizing the other person's defensive state as well. When someone becomes reactive, critical, or shuts down, it's often a sign that their own sense of self is under threat. In prior episodes, for those of you who have been listening along, I've called this a dual perspective. So when he reacts with anger or accusation, or when she becomes more controlling or dismissive, you can begin to understand both of these reactions as organized responses to feeling destabilized internally. In other words, something is going on inside each one of these individuals. If you can hold this in mind, it changes how you interpret their behavior, because now you don't see it as just they're labeling me, but you see it as maybe they are dysregulated. Maybe they are destabilized internally. So then, instead of experiencing it as purely attacking or unreasonable, you can start to see it as organized around protection, that they're trying to protect something. That's the defenses that I keep mentioning. They're defending against a painful feeling. That shift alone can reduce the intensity of your counter reaction. Maybe you won't be so quick to fire back. Oh, and by the way, let me say this. That kind of reaction, it can also be helpful if you check in with her experience. Ask her what she meant when she said something to you. In other words, you don't have to quickly assume that she is just attacking you. In other words, you're trying to get closer to her experience, what's going on inside of her. So when she said, you're controlling, or he said, you're pulling away, the question is, what is she feeling in that moment when she says that? When she says, you're the problem? Understanding her internal experience, this is the dual perspective, by the way, not just understanding your own inner experience, but hers as well. And it can be by way of asking her. This can give you insight into her defenses and make it easier to respond without escalating. And this is where your response can begin to shift the interaction. Rather than reacting, again, impulsively to the surface content, remember, that's the manifest content, you can respond in a way that lowers the threat level rather than escalating it by staying more grounded, more specific, and less reactive. Here, let me give another for example, okay? So instead of counter-attacking, you always do this, or you're this, right? Calling her a name back, or calling him a name, or shutting down. You might want to try to slow things down and respond to the underlying experience, both yours and hers. Remember the dual perspective. I'm noticing that I'm starting to feel pushed out right now. Before decisions like bringing your parents are made, could we take a moment to talk about that together? Again, I'm just making this up, but I'm just demonstrating how you might approach this. Or another slight variation that emphasizes collaboration can look something like this. I'm noticing that I'm feeling a bit pushed out. Can we pause for a second and talk through how decisions like this affect both of us? That's the decision to move the parents into the home, for example, in this prototypical example. But again, you could fill in the blank there, given what's relevant to your situation. In short, you're not trying to, and I quote, win the moment or correct the other person. You're not trying to win or be passive. Well, you'll need to do that if, again, you feel passive or weak or vulnerable. You see, if you have any of those feelings, then you need to win and you need to correct the other person. But in these moments, what I'm describing, you're trying to prevent the interaction from organizing around mutual defensiveness, because the mutual defensiveness is sort of at the heart of these high conflict relationships. The goal is to interrupt the cycle and create the possibility for something different to happen. But if we step back for a moment, the bigger question, again, stepping back from specific things that you may or may not say, the bigger question becomes not just how do you respond, like specifically like the words that I was just giving you, but what you're actually trying to shift in that moment. So, what are we actually trying to shift in the moment? What are you trying to achieve? Or, let me say the more fundamental question, what internal state do you want to be in? And what state are you trying to help the other person move into? Because the goal is not just to manage this conversation, it's to help shift both you and your partner out of a defensive, emotionally flooded state and into a more regulated, reality oriented one where frustration can be tolerated and thinking can come back online. There's that word again that I asked you earlier to keep in mind, thinking. We need space to think. That's when we slow things down. And one of the most effective ways to do this is by reducing the psychological threat in the moment. And again, I say this, I know I repeat myself, but this is critical, by slowing the interaction down. But again, to slow it down, I know this is complicated because remember I said earlier, something inside of you is activated. In part, what you need to discover so that you can position yourself to slow down. So when accusations come in, you're controlling, you're too dependent, you're a narcissist. Instead of responding to the label directly, you can say something like, it sounds like you're really frustrated about how these decisions have been handled. Can we talk about that? This kind of response acknowledges the emotional intensity. That's validation. Shows that you're listening. Avoids reinforcing the label and gently redirects the interaction back toward a conversation. And importantly, this isn't about agreeing or endorsing what's been said. You're not agreeing with the label, but it's about helping the other person feel understood just enough that they no longer need to escalate to be heard. You see, that's the other part of the escalation in these high conflict relationships. Is nobody's listening to one another. So the yelling, the intensification is also a bid to be heard. Because if you're not heard, naturally, what might you do? You might escalate, raise your voice. Anyway, as we begin to wrap this one up, I want to pull together a few key takeaways that you can hold on to in these critical moments. 1, recognize and name your own internal reactions. Before responding, notice what has been triggered in you, feeling pushed out, criticized, overwhelmed, or dismissed. Simply naming your experience creates a small but powerful space between the trigger and your impulsive reaction. 2, contain your emotional response. Slowing down your reaction doesn't mean suppressing your feelings. It doesn't mean being a punching bag. It means holding them long enough so that they don't immediately organize the interaction. Containment allows you to respond thoughtfully rather than reactively, and that has the potential of interrupting the escalating cycle. 3, take that dual perspective. Understand what your partner's defensiveness, criticism, or withdrawal, that it's often a protective response to feeling destabilized internally. Seeing both sides as organized around self-protection, your side and her side, rather than labeling them as a narcissist or unreasonable. All of this stuff has the potential of reducing the intensity of your own counter reaction and their reaction to your reaction. And finally, 4, shift the interaction by reducing the psychological threat, responding in ways that acknowledge emotional intensity without escalating it. And I gave an example of that. Slow down the interaction, validate feelings, invite dialogue, try to understand where they're coming from. Phrases like, I'm noticing, or I'm feeling pushed out, or I noticed, or you seem to be annoyed. Am I reading that correctly? Are you upset with me? Can we talk about that? Can we pause for a moment and look at this together? That has the potential of shifting both people toward what? A more regulated, reality-oriented state of mind where reflection and collaboration finally become possible. One more useful pattern that you can keep in mind when in a high conflict relationship is a simple sequence. Contain, validate, redirect, return to the task at hand, which is, by the way, what? Having a conversation, a discussion with a loved one. There's still so much more to say about this, but we have to stop here for now. If this spoke to you and you're curious to learn more about all issues related to narcissism, please support the show by subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next. And even more importantly, take a moment to leave a review. Reviews make the podcast easier for others to find, which helps the show grow. The more the show grows, the more I can invest in creating thoughtful content that supports you in understanding and navigating your experiences with narcissism. Okay, thanks for being here with me. I'm grateful we got to explore this one together. Until next time, take care of yourself. Bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.